Welcome everybody. So today's session, we are very pleased to offer on this topic of building community resilience, and that is using climate education as a first step. So this is an Urban Waters Learning Network webinar. Welcome and thank you all for joining us. For those of you who might be new to the Urban Waters Learning Network, let me just do brief introductions. The Urban Waters Learning Network is a peer-to-peer network that is coordinated by both Groundwork USA, our partner organization, and River Network. My name is Deanna Toledo with River Network. I am one of the coordinators of the Learning Network. And the goal of the Learning Network is really to bring together both individuals and organizations that are working on urban waterways, focusing both on restoring the waterways and revitalizing the communities that surround them. So this topic today, like I said earlier, today's is the first webinar in what will be a series of 3 or 4 different webinars. And our goal for this series is really to focus on this topic of building community and climate resilience. Many communities that are represented in the Urban Waters Learning Network are experiencing impacts of a changing climate, and that includes communities like New Orleans, Houston, the whole island of Puerto Rico, New York, New Jersey, communities that have lived through really record-setting historic storms. But it also includes communities that are experiencing smaller flooding events that are happening much more frequently. And the list of those communities is really too long to review. So today's webinar is really a first in this series. Our effort is to help members of our community build both community and climate resilience through education, through mitigation, and through planning. And so the questions are, how do we, help our communities really prepare for these more extreme weather events? How do we engage members of our communities in identifying and putting in place solutions that build resilience, both climate and community resilience, and do so in an equitable way? And so in future sessions, and we'll pick those back up after our upcoming conference River Rally. So starting in late July or August, we're still working on the date for the next session. We're going to focus and highlight examples of communities that are undertaking resilience planning, really from the community perspective, and engaging community voices in that planning process. And we'll also learn from peers in our network about what the recovery phase looks like following extreme weather events, and how do we ensure that community members are at the table in that recovery. But today's session begins with climate education. So the question of how do we incorporate climate education, and we really see it as an important initial step to building resilience and to bringing this conversation to our community. So we've got some great speakers lined up to both help us get on the same page with some climate basics and to share how they're incorporating climate education into their own work and their communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Renee Mazurek, who's been doing a lot of the work and a lot of the research on this, and she'll introduce our presenters today.
Thanks, Deanna. So our presenters today, we have Jennifer Sloan. She's the Director of Education at Groundwork Hudson Valley. She combines her passions for science education, sustainable agriculture, and environmentalism by managing programs on the Groundwork Hudson Valley Science Barge, which is an urban floating farm and environmental education center. Jennifer also helped to create the climate curriculum that we will learn more about today. Juliana Gonzalez has been the executive director for the Watershed Project since 2015. She's originally from Colombia, where she worked on watershed planning and policy development for the Andes of southwestern Colombia. Juliana has a passion for community-based projects and believes the importance of education and community-based stewardship. Alicia Lair has been the executive director of the Woonsocket River Watershed Council since 2008. She has spearheaded work from migratory fish passage restoration to Superfund site cleanup. Alicia is also an active member of the Rhode Island Green Infrastructure Coalition, which has helped her to create green infrastructure demonstration projects in underserved communities that are prone to flooding, and to begin to develop larger plans to make the Woonsocket corridor more resilient in the face of climate change. So I just want to say thanks to our presenters for joining us today, and I encourage all of the audience to ask your questions throughout the presentation. We will stop at different times to address them during the webinar, as well as address questions at the end of the webinar. So thanks again, and with that, I will hand it over to Jennifer to get us started.
Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer. I work, as she said, on the science barge and with Groundwork Hudson Valley, and I'm just getting my slides set up. So what I'm going to be presenting on is a little bit of the last 4 years that we've been working on a NOAA grant through environmental literacy. And this was a competitive grant that we received in order to teach about climate change in Yonkers. Yonkers is in New York. It's bordering the Hudson River, but it also has the Bronx River and the Sawmill River running through it. So it's a 3-river town, and it experienced some damages from Hurricane Sandy along the shoreline, and that probably led itself to receiving this grant. In addition to that, we partner with the Center for the Urban River at BSAC, so you'll see their logo on the bottom right. They are now, they work with Sarah Lawrence College now, and they do a lot of really great coastal programming, so that really helped to make our program very, very strong. And so I'll give you a little bit of a background on the global local coastal program that we ran, and then how that kind of birthed a comprehensive curriculum that we shared with teachers now. So before we really get started, though, I tend to have very long presentations because I have so much I want to share. Obviously, 4 years of learning about this stuff myself. It's all kind of in my head. So I was hoping we could share a couple of polls just to get a read of the room in terms of what you guys understand about climate change, what you guys consider the most important aspects or impacts from climate change to your communities, and then how you're communicating about it and what sort of obstacles you face in communicating with your community members or your whatever audience you're serving. So maybe we can get some help with that.
So folks, you should be able to see the poll in your screen. I'm seeing folks are weighing in. Going to give it a few more seconds here. A couple more folks still answering the poll. I'm going to close it here. Okay, I'll go ahead and close it and share the results. Jennifer, can you see those?
Yeah, I need to probably expand it out, but yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so let me read them off. So how confident are you in your knowledge about climate change? About a quarter of folks say they're very confident. 11% not very confident, and everybody else, about half of them, are somewhat confident in their ability to do so.
Great.
Okay.
And the next one? Are we doing all 3 questions now?
Yeah, let's go ahead. So the next poll is, what is your top concern about climate change? If you could go ahead and respond to the poll. The responses are now coming in. And if there's other, we can only get, there's a lot of concerns we could list. If there's something that's not on the list, please go ahead and use the question box to put in what else is concerning. What is your top concern that may not be reflected on that poll? All right, we've got a few more folks coming in with their responses. I'm going to go ahead and close it and share the results. And they're pretty evenly distributed. Ecosystem collapse.
Yeah, I see that.
Okay.
Okay.
So let me, for folks who may be only on the phone, ecosystem collapse, about half of respondents, this is their top concern, followed by extreme weather events, about 21% of folks, Then sea level rise and coastal issues is the top concern for 14% of you, and then followed by agriculture and water, and lastly, public health.
And then the last question is just about what sort of obstacles you feel you face for teaching about climate change.
Yeah, so you should be able to see that poll. What is your greatest challenge in communicating with others around climate change? We've got some. Okay, let me go ahead and see. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And so, what is your greatest challenge in communicating with others around climate change? 43% of you say it's overly politicized. Then about a quarter of you is too complex, don't know where to begin. 20% of you point to lacking resources, which shows up there twice. I'm sorry about that. And 7% of you say it's just too depressing. So there you go. I'll go
Thank
ahead
you so much.
and
That's very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So something I've seen when I poll audiences in the past is that a lot of times, and this wasn't an option for you guys, but that when we talk about climate change, we very rarely make it personal. And that's something that comes up a lot in our education programs, that if we don't make something personal, that it doesn't really connect with our audience. And so a lot of times as educators, as environmentalists, we think about much broader concepts. So we'll have this re-emerging theme throughout this presentation about trying to bring it back down to people on the ground level in local areas, people that you know in our communities, because then we can kind of be moved to action a lot faster, and we can see the impacts of our actions for resilience as well. And that's probably the best approach, generally speaking. So this Global Local Coastal program was funded in 2015. So as I said, we're in our 4th year in closing out the program. And we partnered with the Yonkers Board of Education to teach 12 high school classes over the course of 2 years. In these 3 different experiential learning sites. So we taught a total of about 700 students enrolled in the program. And we toured them to a couple different places so they could learn about climate change on a global level, also start to explore the science behind climate change and how we study it so they can kind of demystify how we know anything's happening at all and what the human impact of that has been in terms of our carbon footprint. Then we also let them go to the Center for the Urban River at BSAC, just 2 blocks north of the Science Barge, and learn a little bit about the coastal impacts on the Hudson River and ocean acidification. And then the 2 right-hand pictures are of our eco house on the inside, where we got to break things down to a hyper-local level, what we're doing in our own homes that affects our water footprint and our carbon footprint, and then how we can weather powerful storms that might be in our area and manage our own water footprint around the home as well. So that was trying to getting into individual readiness issues. So that's just to sum up what we did at the first site, the Science Barge. We spoke a lot about the human factors in the climate change there, but we moved then towards talking about the impacts. And we have a lot of lessons that were learned from doing that. It's very, very downer information, obviously. And so we wanted to we knew we wanted to end with a tour of resilience strategies so we could start seeing what we could be doing in terms of the agricultural sector, energy sector, and for public health to start to combat that. But they dove into that a lot more at the Center for the Urban River at BSAC, where they got to learn a little bit about green infrastructure and using wetlands as buffers. The Center for the Urban River is along this very built waterfront in Yonkers, where Hurricane Sandy brought a 6-foot storm surge. And it flooded all the way up to the library and a lot of the apartment buildings and the train station. And yet this center that you see in the top left picture is right on the shorefront, but it wasn't flooded. And so they got to see really how the natural environment being utilized as a sponge to the Hudson actually helped to make that property more resilient to Hurricane Sandy and other storm surges in the future. And then finally, like I said, we were at Eco House, and for that section, they got to do their own carbon footprint game and start to form coalitions on how they can group together and reduce their carbon footprint, do an energy and water audit in the home. And then we did an emergency prep scavenger hunt where they actually got to search the drawers and the cabinets and the shelves and try to find everything that should be in a 72-hour emergency preparedness kit, and also learned a little bit more about what actions they should take in case of flash flooding events, hurricanes, high winds, and heat waves, all the things that are most likely to affect us in Yonkers. So from that, we learned a couple of lessons. One, that climate systems are really complex, and so there's a lot of, it's really tricky in order to teach people about these systems, that we kind of had this huge span of information we were trying to share in this program, and maybe it was too much to be sharing, but that's how the grant was written. And so bringing them to each site and letting them dig in a little bit better helped, and spacing out those experiential learning programs helped as well, so they can digest the information in more bite-sized pieces. But it's probably best to sort of sum up the key understandings in a couple of ways. One, that the planet is experiencing accelerated warming, not just that we're in a warming trend post the last ice age, but that we are experiencing accelerated warming due to greenhouse gas emissions. And right now we are at the highest amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at over, I think, 415 parts per million. And we're getting on par with what we were experiencing 22 million years ago, when we had a very different planet. So it's not that life can't be supported in a warmer planet, it's that when we accelerate the change, there's not a lot of time for things to adapt. So our key risks are sea level rise, fresh water availability, to us, heat waves and what that means for public health, and then of course ecosystem breakdown, because of course all species are affected and they kind of all depend upon each other. So how do we make that hyper-local? Well, there's a couple of really great resources online that I'm going to be sharing at the end, but one is the NOAA Climate Resilience Toolkit, and that helps you work together with your community members to start to identify very local vulnerabilities by tracking what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data has for all these different cities around the United States, and then identifying some of the best management practices for those adaptation strategies. So another really important lesson learned is that, of course, climate change affects everyone. Our students were high school students, and a lot of them either had family members who were affected by Hurricane Maria, and therefore were really invested in the program as it was happening right after Hurricane Maria. But then we also had plenty of students that said, well, I've never had a hurricane affect me, and we don't really get them that much up here, and really climate change isn't going to affect me. So I thought one thing that kind of reached them was by talking about where it does affect everybody, which is at our wallets. And of course, climate change is going to affect us all in the decades to come, but we need to be moved to action now. And so when you start to see that billion-dollar disasters are spiking, and this is not even including 2017 on this graph, which of course we had 3 billion-dollar hurricanes, actually multi-billion-dollar hurricanes. So we can see that this affects the cost of goods and services, and it affects insurance rates and the availability of resources. And so this is a lot to overcome when we have major damage to our infrastructure that we have to build back from. So that should help us all get motivated on both a local and a national level. Also, for me personally, and I think for a lot of my crew, we learned that climate grief is real. I just read an article about this, and after working on this project for 4 years, it's hard to not feel the burden of knowing all this information and worrying about if we'll be moved to action. So taking time for yourself and going to places that recharge you is really important as educators. If we don't have hope, then it's really hard to convey hope to others. The article that I read also had a really poignant quote, which was that that hope is not a lottery ticket that you clutch, thinking that maybe you have the winning numbers. It's an axe to break down the house door when the house is on fire. But first, you need to know that the house is on fire. So I thought that was a really important quote to kind of think to wrap my brain around, that we need to be able to move to action, but we also have to make sure we understand what's going on. So the other quote I don't have directly, but it's think locally, act globally. Of course, we know the other way around, but when it comes to climate change, it's such a vast problem that sometimes it can kind of be paralyzing. So one of my heroes, Jane Goodall, was just speaking about how with climate change issues, we really need to think on a local level. And then the sort of measures that we take on a local level, the adaptation strategies that we form, the different things we do at the community level can be scalable to a global level. That there are ways to share that information now around the globe. And so really it makes more sense to start with your own community when it comes to this stuff. And that translates to also some studies by the New York Times. This was a poll done where most people do believe that climate change will harm people, but most people do not believe that it'll harm them personally. And so that's why we need to start talking about local impacts. Because, of course, if you can't personalize what's happening, it's hard to move to action. So that's going to kind of push us towards what we did next, which was our distance learning module, and how we were going to kind of translate some of the curriculum that we developed for these programs at our sites into something that could be a teacher resource. And even though this was written into the grant, it was such a small portion of the grant. It really was just supposed to be like a satellite-based program that we ran once or twice to a couple of classrooms. But instead, we decided to create a curriculum that anybody could use. So some of the reason for that is because in the NPR poll, you can see that most want climate education. That we're actually past the hump. We're over the hump. Most people really want to know more about climate change and believe in climate change. But then when we look at how many people are actually teaching about it, it's less than half of parents and even fewer teachers teaching about climate change. So we want to make sure that we can overcome some of the obstacles to teaching about climate change. That includes getting over the fact that even teachers sometimes have a tenuous grasp. So as you can see on the right, and this is what was my experience too on the science barge, teachers like, oh yeah, we're teaching about climate change in the classroom, and it's all about the hole in the ozone. And ozone plays such a minute role in terms of global warming. So they're kind of, they want to teach about, their intentions are really great, but they're missing the mark. There's also an inundation of misinformation, that the science is unsettled and whatnot. And of course, like you guys marked on your poll, that there is a political landscape to navigate. So what NOAA does is they focus on resiliency education, but I think it's really important to teach about carbon mitigation too, which is something as a national organization, they're not pushing as much because of the political landscape, but it's something we can do on our local levels. So what did we do with this information? Well, we created a distance learning module. So all these pooled resources kind of showed me that there was too much information for a teacher to go through online, and it was really intimidating for them. So we wanted to make these resources easily available. There's really great, rich resources on CLEAN, that's the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, on NOAA's website, on PBS Learning Media Library. But even if you started going down that rabbit hole, it's endless, and teachers are already overwhelmed by how much information and how much work they have to do to put together their curriculum for the year. So we want to make this stuff really easy to jump right in. So we use our DLM, our distance learning module, in 3 ways: as a full curriculum with a web app that teachers can use comprehensively, or they can just kind of select a la carte classroom activities, or they can use it as a supplement to visiting one of our sites. So this is an image of some of the curriculum that you'll find online, and there should be links available. We'll make sure they're available where you can download the entire 90-something page PDF file. There's a lot of hyperlinks to the different units, and the main units are covering climate change and paleoclimatology, climate change impact, adaptation and resiliency, and of course mitigation. So in addition to that, we have a web application it's just online web application, And so it's just kind of a directory for all these really great resources online. They're not a lot of resources that we've created, but we've made accessible, and maybe a couple that we created ourselves. And so you can navigate through that app, through these different these bars: climate science, climate change impact, and adaptation resiliency, and then explore through there in order to find a number of videos, widgets, labs, slideshows, all sorts of really great stuff. So you can kind of hit the ground running and start to use that for whatever audience you're teaching to.
Jennifer, I just want to do
So our units, what was that?
Minutes. I just want to give you a time check. You're about 15 minutes.
Yep. Okay, great. So our curriculum follows the 5E lesson plan, which is inquiry-based. So engagement to pique the audience's interest, exploration where they engage in hands-on activities and interactive labs. So they're kind of exploring the topic on their own. Then only after they've gone through an exploration phase that they do an explanation phase, where they can start to learn a little bit about the vocabulary and the concepts are explained. Then elaboration, so possible extensions to these activities where they can connect it to previous investigations. And then evaluation I didn't always include. I figured most teachers have their own ways of evaluating their work. The main units is Unit 1. I'm probably going to go through this pretty quickly so we can end on time. And so we talked about climate science, which includes, and this might not be really important for everybody to do. It depends on your audience. But I do think demystifying the difference between climate and weather and how we know the climate is changing can be useful to the right audience, especially to kind of break down skepticism. So I feel like my students feel a lot more strongly that they understand what's happening, and so they're less likely to be dismayed or apathetic based on other people's commentary now, because they're like, no, I kind of researched this, I studied this, I understand what's going on and why it matters so much right now. So that's why we have a strong climate science unit where we explain the difference between climate and weather. We also go into climate proxies, so we understand how climate is changing now versus how it did in the past. And really that's about time. So climate change in the past took thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years, to kind of go through these cycles of glacial and interglacial periods. Now we're experiencing them in our lifetime. So those climate proxies help us to understand that. And climate proxies are just paleoclimatology data based on tree rings and sediment cores and fossils and ice cores. It's a really fun tool to explore if you're very science heavy in your audience, because then they're really interacting with data. Then, of course, our impacts on every sector, from forests and ecosystems to water cycle and how it affects our freshwater availability, how that impacts health when we have more vector species from warmer temperatures and more flood events. We have the movement of pathogens. And of course, air pollution quality goes up when you have a warmer atmosphere as well. And then, of course, what it means for food and fresh water availability. So for that, in our web application, they can explore a whole bunch of resources on each of them so they can start to see what's happening on all of these different sectors. And I encourage you guys to explore through that. Then finally moving to what we can do about it, because of course, that's the most important thing. So mitigation being a little bit about how we can reduce our carbon footprint, both on a global level and a personal level. And I think now there's, a growing gloom and doom about this when you hear about the Paris Agreement that the U.S. wants to withdraw from, and that maybe that wasn't enough even in and of itself. But, or how there's so few corporations that are really causing the majority of carbon emissions. But when you start to look at what city centers are doing. Right now, by the way, every country in the world is still committed in some ways to the Paris Agreement. Nobody can legally withdraw until November 2019. So that's a great thing. But in addition to that, there is over 200 mayors of major U.S. cities that are completely committed to the Paris Agreement. So there is work being done, and there's lots of reasons for hope. And it's really good to emphasize that. And so if you start seeing that if you live in a population center in a city and you start to move to action in your own city, not only is that scalable, but it also can have greater impact because, the U.S., some of our cities are greater than in population than some countries around the world. So what we do on a sea level really matters, and that's a good message to go across in mitigation. So there's also resources in calculating your own personal carbon footprint on the web application. Then moving to adaptation resiliency. So that is really a localized sort of strategy. So I'll leave that for you guys to explore. But the NOAA Climate Explorer, it helps you to see how your locale is going to be changing in the future, and so you can kind of figure out what makes sense for you guys. So this is just, where am I at on time?
If you can start wrapping it up, you've got just a couple minutes.
Okay, great. So best practices for anybody that has a resource like a nature center or some sort of educational site. Sometimes it's about rebranding what you're already doing and using your own natural assets to teach about this. So, oftentimes we're already teaching around climate change all the time. So whether you're doing phenology studies or water quality studies, there's already stuff that we can kind of dig in there to get people engaged. Citizen science is becoming more and more popular, which is great. And so when you can engage community members into doing some of these citizen science projects, it's easier to build upon that conversation about what climate change is doing to their local environment. Helping people find their own voice, letting people share their stories, whether in written form or in group discussion, or through the arts, whether they're doing an art project or poem. It's really important to kind of feel that emotional connection to this material. And then if you're working with young people, I find it's really important to keep them moving. So this curriculum online has those unit overviews for a quick primer on the information, chapters where you can kind of dig into each one of the, if there's like a whole chapter, for instance, on polar ice melt, in the climate change impact unit. So you can dig in a little bit more deeply into the material and kind of understand it for yourself and translate it to your audience. And then the classroom activities are geared towards that. And all of those are meant to be interactive and keep people moving, because I think kids sit down way too often anyway. Whenever you can incentivize students through service learning projects and even paid internships or fulfilling some sort of school requirement, or connecting it to the standards to incentivize teachers to use this material, that's really helpful as well. And of course, avoiding doom and gloom. So the idea is to help to identify the right resiliency measures for your community, as I said before. So that means just kind of knowing what's going on, and the Climate Resilience Toolkit online from NOAA that I shared is really, really helpful in that. And then how we can leverage collective power to make the most impact. And that's it. So I don't know if I'll take a couple questions now or at the end, I guess.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me, there is a couple of questions. Before we turn to that, Juliana, can you speak up and make sure we've got your sound working? Because I will hand off presenter status to you.
I think that I figured out something.
Okay, perfect. So let me go ahead and start switching to Jennifer as the presenter, but in the meantime, let me, a couple of questions for you, Jennifer. Do you know if there are more recent studies about teacher, what is it? I'm having trouble seeing this. Is there a more recent study that looks at teachers' views on what is causing climate change that is more recent than the one you cited? And also there's
sorry, yeah, I don't know it. I don't know about that offhand.
Okay. And
on that NPR, the one that I quoted about teachers wanting to teach about climate change versus how many do, there's actually other polls included on that. I'm not sure they really dig specifically into that question, but it's a great article about teaching about climate change. This is meant for a student level, but yeah, it's an NPR article that was just published a couple weeks back.
Great. And the other question is, there's interest in seeing the exercise materials for your emergency preparedness scavenger hunt. Is that something that you might be able to share with folks?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple PDFs for that. And by the way, I didn't actually share some. I didn't toggle over to my web application or to the climate change, but I see that you shared the link to our climate change resilience learning module online. And on there, there's a lot of downloads available, as well as the curriculum in full by itself. And the curriculum hyperlinks to, depending on what unit you're trying to cover, you can get to that unit pretty quickly through the hyperlinks on the PDF. And then that even hyperlinks to sometimes external sources of materials and downloads. So it's just like a huge repository of information there and on the web application as well. So I really encourage people to kind of click through that and see what they can utilize. We want to see if we can get that out there and get it used. We'd love feedback on it too, if you're able to provide that by emailing one of us on how that may have served you or what you'd like to see on it. The 72-hour kit we do in our eco house, so it just looks like a home in there. And basically, it's anything. There's resources on FEMA on what belongs in a 72-hour kit and why. And so we created our own for the scavenger hunt, but we also pass out the fully fledged FEMA form. There's ones that are made for kids, and there's even really great resources on what to do during a hurricane or a heat wave or a winter storm, also on the website. There's a FEMA app that we always go through as well, and kids are usually able to download that. I've had fourth graders download that onto their phones and start to see all the things they can plug into that. And that includes all sorts of natural disasters and other sorts of emergency preparedness measures that you can keep kind of finger ready on your phone at all times. But the 72-hour scavenger hunt that I did, you just buy everything at a dollar store. You would need on the 72-hour kit, and we just hide it around the eco house. You can hide it around any room or classroom, and let the students have to go around and do like a little puzzle solving and figure out what's what and where to find it and why it belongs in a kit. So easy enough to kind of put together your own as well.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jennifer. And for those of you, again, I turn your attention to the handout and the questions boxes in this control panel. You'll see the handout that includes all of the slides for all three presenters in a single document, and that's where you'll see the link to Groundwork's curriculum. So we're going to shift a little bit here from working with a young audience to Juliana Gonzalez in the Watershed Project, who is integrating climate education work into their own programming with both adult and youth. So Juliana, you want to go ahead and get started? I think we're seeing your slides.
Great. Hello, my name is Juliana Gonzalez, and I'm the Executive Director of the Watershed Project in California, in the Bay Area. And our mission is very broad, is to inspire Bay Area communities to understand, appreciate, and protect our local watersheds. But we do this through kind of two main program areas or strategies. One is kind of a restoration strategy, and the other one is an education strategy, both of which are connected to just making sure that people love the Bay Area so that they can explore it and they understand it, and because they do that, they care for it, and we create opportunities for them to be able to plug in and help with all aspects of mostly adaptation strategies for climate change. In our restoration component, which is what I'm going to be talking about, we also do long-term planning for resiliency projects and watershed planning. And in our education programs, we do climate and watershed education in many of our curriculum that are a target for mostly K to 12, but we have kind of an educational kind of climate-specific program for high schoolers, and we have just more of an exploration component for elementary school students, and some of the middle schoolers kind of go either way. But I'm not going to be showing that today. If people are interested, we have like 20 years of curriculum development on kind of watershed education in a more traditional way, and some units also funded by NOAA through our oyster restoration programs. We have incorporated the climate aspects into that. So today I'm going to be talking more about this kind of restoration ideas. And what we want to do is we want to develop these community-based solutions for the urban watersheds so that they can be better adapted for climate change. So we embarked in many strategies that include green infrastructure, urban canopy, sustainable gardening. We also work on marine debris prevention and education so that people understand that we're all living in a watershed and the trash and litter travels into the bay and then into the ocean and that type of thing. And we do a lot of large cleanup events um, in our restoration projects. And we also engage the youth in doing a lot of hands-on stewardship and science, kind of citizen science data collection, both on water quality and other. Um, but what we wanted to present today was like this very long-term planning, visioning exercises we have been doing, and we are using kind of we're working mostly in two neighborhoods in the city of Richmond, California. One is called the Iron Triangle, and it has a long greenway. And the other one is the North Richmond neighborhood, which is kind of more contained neighborhood. So I think I'm going to concentrate mostly on that. And the idea is to find kind of environmental justice and resiliency projects that can benefit the community and also provide climate resiliency. So we're facilitating equitable and inclusive infrastructure planning and environmental justice projects that can be implemented in the short term and also those that can be incorporated into the 2040 master plans, both for the county and the cities. And we also are actively promoting green infrastructure and access to shoreline and natural areas. So these are some of the locations of our projects in the area. We have 36 small scale projects. Some of these projects may be just a garden. Some of them are like the length of an entire city block. And in the shoreline we have done some wetland restoration and some oyster reef projects. So now just getting into the neighborhood project that I wanted to present. Um, this this is an image provided by a designer group called Mithun, and they kind of did a vision and exercise of what the area would look like by like it was supposed to be 2100. It ended being more like 2070, where by the time like we will have kind of all the areas that will be affected by sea level rise. And what we did is we worked very closely with graphic designers to create um, multiple aids for this visioning project. So the first project we worked on was in 2017, and it was kind of dreaming what the shoreline could look like and what kind of activities people wanted to see more of on along that shoreline. So that was called the North Richmond Shoreline Visioning, a community-based approach. It was led by an organization called the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. We were one of the partners. We acted as the community liaison for the project, and we were the ones that were interviewing neighbors and community members about kind of their dreams and fears about the future along the shoreline. We also had a group of scientists from SFEI working on defining what that shoreline is and what is kind of the transition zone um, ecotone and how far will it go into the neighborhood and how far could a wetland or a kind of a buffer area be um, kind of extended into. So like we mapped that area kind of with the scientists and then using some of that information we went back to community. And I will explain that in a minute. Then I will also talk about the Resilient by Design competition or challenge, which ended in 2018. And probably will not have time to go to kind of what we're doing now, which is kind of connecting a quality of life master plan to the water needs assessment that is being developed to help the integrated water management authority in the Bay Area to identify priority projects for funding. So the first project is this kind of visioning of the shoreline. as a methodology, what we did is we met with the scientists first and came up with kind of like the areas where the projects could potentially go after defining what that transition zone was. And
Juliana,
there was,
some folks are
yeah,
having trouble hearing you. If you might speak up a little bit, that would be great.
sure. So what we did is we met with the designers and with the scientists and identified the area where the projects could go, and then define kind of a time frame for when we wanted to have this adaptation and implementations projects being like kind of in the public like sphere so that we could move them forward for funding. And so we settled on projects that could be implemented within 5 to 10 years. And we, with that information, went to design a survey. Um, so the first part of the survey was a visual survey, a map that you can see on the left that has kind of a bird's eye view of this neighborhood and shoreline, and kind of showing some of the points of interest, mostly in the neighborhoods that people could be oriented. This neighborhood, the North Richmond neighborhood, has two creeks that drain through the area. It's a fairly small area, 3,000 people live in this neighborhood, and the neighborhood is surrounded by industrial development and is dissected by the railroad tracks and also highways that separate the neighborhood from the shoreline. But there are a couple places of connectivity, plus the neighborhood was originally mostly African American from the Rosie the Riveter era when it was redlined. So it has traditionally been like an area that had a lot of low-income housing and subsidized housing. And recently it has kind of flipped due to the fact that they demolished those units and now has created kind of a lot of opportunities in the neighborhood, but that also has changed the demographics in the area. And so we were kind of working with people that were also looking at elements of gentrification and connectivity that we needed to kind of consider in the design of what projects could go along the shoreline. But with that in mind, in this project, we left kind of the neighborhood opportunities behind, and we'll develop them in the next study, which I will explain later. In this one, we were just looking at the shoreline. So the first question we had for people was like, how are you using the shoreline today? And is there any piece of this that you love or care for? And so people will like just kind of write the type of activities that they do already in this vicinity. And some people had activities that they do inland, but mostly we were concentrated in the shoreline. And once we had kind of the type of activities that people were familiar with, we created kind of a voting system with visual a visual survey in which the community will tell us like what they wanted to see more of in the future. And this was mostly built as a recreational survey. And
Juliana, you have about 5 more minutes. I just want to give you a time check here.
Sure. And so it had a private survey too that will explain the kind of constraints and limitations for people accessing the shoreline. We made sure that it was very visually simple and like that people didn't have to write necessarily. They could just tell us what was their opinion and we'll write for them. They were all translated and we made sure that people who had access to this, we ended interviewing close to 300 people that participated both in the visual and the written survey. And this resulted on this map that has the 8 priority projects that kind of combine people's recreational desires with the kind of restoration opportunities that were identified with the stakeholders and landowners of these parcels. So that was the first study. The second one was more in the neighborhood, and we were just looking mostly at the intersection of housing with green infrastructure. And this was done as part of the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge. The Mithun was the kind of the landscape architecture firm that we work with. They chose us to participate as part of the home team. There were 10 teams around the bay, and each team had a neighborhood, and they developed ideas for climate adaptation and resiliency. In our piece, we decided to do a community advisory board as a way to engage the community. So instead of doing a survey to the entire community, we just did a lot of informational interviews with community members and stakeholders until we found a group of people that could commit to do an intensive planning effort for 3 months, and we educated them at the meetings so that they will learn about the different issues that we were trying to address in this neighborhood. So the landscape architecture firm and the advisory board will kind of come up with ideas in these sessions, and then the landscape architecture firm will come back with displays that will simplify and explain some of the ideas that we wanted the community to learn about. Recruiting an advisory board that is representative of the community was really important. We had a lot of goals for the different recruitment strategies, so that like we will like be reaching very different types of people, and so we looked at that and came up with like a 20-member board that had representatives from different interests, topic groups, different ages, race and gender, and also like that live or in like the vicinity, but some of them like were in kind of the neighboring communities that were also affected. So this is a picture of our community advisory board during one of the last sessions, and we held multiple meetings, but 4 large meetings to present to the entire board, where we will kind of have this listening sessions where people will brainstorm about ideas and funding opportunities and models. But the most important piece of this exercise was to be able to simplify the information to have very clean graphics that will help us with the education to general public so that we could move these projects forward after the challenge, which is what we're doing now. One of the strategies of the resiliency plan was to have more urban forestry. And so this relates to the potential plots and opportunities for urban forestry. That includes creating urban air quality parks in the larger parcels, like along the transportation corridors, having like this neighborhood greenways, and then train nodes in large parcels that could have bigger trees with more shade. Along the shoreline, there were a lot of ideas around employment and recreation connecting. So having this kind of green infrastructure jobs and youth development force projects connected to creating more resiliency along the shoreline and protecting the infrastructure with wetlands and oyster reefs was something we had identified before, but in this project we were just trying to link it. And the graphic designers were able to produce images for people so that they could see what if we were to transform this lot into a park, how will that look like, and give more identity to the neighborhood. And in the transportation, and which was the relate, how can we connect the community with bicycle pedestrians that link not only to the regional transportation nodes, but also the neighborhood to the shoreline, which currently it doesn't have an overpass. And in the strategy of Thrive was more about this low-income housing and kind of thinking about these vacant lots that could be used for more affordable housing that at the same time could have some green infrastructure, and so gray water and rainwater harvesting, as well as creating these community spaces. So designing the spaces so that they're more resilient by design. So that was the entire premise of this competition, and the idea was that all projects will have this web of relationships that will make them multi-benefit and will allow us to do different type of fundraising. In the Bay Area right now, we have two very large bonds that have been passed by voters to green the Bay Area. And so the idea was to start getting the projects ready and the ideas developed so that like we could move forward and have these neighborhoods that are like heavily affected by like pollution levels. Like this area has a lot of pollutants from Chevron has a refinery in the area that often has like incidents, and there is like diesel trucks going around in those highways that dissect the community. So the idea was to start thinking about strategies that could be started today, but that also could be incorporated in the 2040 planning for the county, so that both these two creeks, the shoreline and the neighborhood, could be greener.
Juliana, if I could
know.
ask you to wrap it up so we have time for the last speaker, that would be great.
Yeah, great. And I think that like just there is like this is just the same rendition that they did for kind of what we want. So that's what I have for you guys. Like I don't know if you guys have questions about the methodology, or if you want to see some of these documents, we have them online. We can facilitate people having links to the actual plans and methodologies for how we gather information from the public for these two projects.
Great. Juliana, a question has come up that I just sent it to you. If you could answer in writing about funding for the project, and we can share that out via the question box. But I want to go ahead and turn it to Alicia. So thank you, Juliana. I also want to highlight in the handout section, there's a survey, both in English and Spanish, that Alicia is going to refer to. So please take a look at that. So with that, Alicia. And Alicia, you might be muted. Okay, can you try that again? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for having me today. I also have with me here Allegra Sharp, who is my partner at One Neighborhood Builders, and we worked on this together as part of a health equity zone in Providence. So I'll try to move through this pretty quickly because I know we're running low on time, but we'll give you a good idea of what we worked on. So first of all, just to give you an idea of what our health equity zone, or HEZ, is, throughout Rhode Island, the Departments of Health funded collaborations with nonprofits, residents, and clinical partners to improve economic opportunities like access to affordable food or redevelopment of distressed and vacant properties, doing also workforce development. Another goal was to reduce unnecessary healthcare spending while improving health outcomes and engaging the community. So this was already working together for about 4 years when the Department of Health came up with a resilience to climate change project, and they supported our HEZ in trying to reach out to the community to make it more resilient. So it planned for the effects of climate change. The goal was to cultivate community leadership, reduce health disparities, build social cohesion, increase community resilience, We also are working to building knowledge in the community and learn from one another. So there's 3 HESs that are part of the Climate Resilience Initiative, and we all get together and we learn from each other. So each HES did different things, and I'm just going to tell you what our HES did. Just to give you a little background and perspective of the area that we're talking about, this is Rhode Island. You can see the little inset map there. We are the littlest state in the United States, and we're working in the Woonasquatucket watershed, which is just a tiny watershed. For the rest of the country, this is just a minuscule part of the world, but in fact, it covers a quarter of the population of the state of Rhode Island because it's so heavily populated in the Providence area. This is the watershed that goes through the capital city. And we focused on one neighborhood in Providence. The green outlined area is where the Woonasquatucket watershed is in Providence. And then the one that's highlighted there in yellow with the star is the neighborhood of Olneyville. So we focused very much on Olneyville, and you'll know why in a minute. In Olneyville, the Department of Health came up with these wonderful maps for us to help the HES inform ourselves on what we could talk to people about that they would be interested in, because as some of our earlier speakers discussed, engaging the community, we have to meet them where they are and talk about the issues that are affecting them directly. This first one shows the heat islands in Olneyville, and the one farthest south there is actually Olneyville Square, and it's where it's the major shopping area and Main Street for this neighborhood in Providence. And this map that also was done by the Department of Health shows areas that are prone to flooding. And during the 1-inch storm, we already have flooding issues, and that's a very common storm in Olneyville. So in those darker areas, we already have issues with just, moderate flooding happening there on a regular basis. This is just kind of our FEMA map of the 100-year flood zone, but as most of you know, and this is particularly true in the Northeast United States, what used to be a 1,000-year flood event, which was like Superstorm Sandy or Harvey, is now really more of a 30-year event. And it may become even worse than that, an event that we'll see every few years. So there's that area on the right where there's major thoroughfare for the town of the neighborhood of Olneyville. There's a great deal of flooding in that area. Here's what it looks like. In March of 2010, we had a major flood in the area. This is Valley Street, one of the major sections through Olneyville. And this picture is significant because if you look at that Price Right Market in Eagle Square, that is the supermarket for the neighborhood. Really, it's the only one. And that was completely flooded out, so was access to it, and access to other parts of the city was flooded out in 2010. So we were kind of starting from ground zero with our HES, and our first goal was to just gather data about what people knew and whether they had any idea about climate change and preparedness. So we designed our study to survey 100 people. We hired 2 bilingual surveyors to go out and survey these 100 people. The surveyors completed a 1-hour training, and they offered respondents $15 Price Right gift cards to take the few minutes to talk to them. And we were specifically targeting the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx residents that represent the Olneyville population. We also had an online survey available so we could get more results from people who were willing to go online, and that was done through SurveyMonkey. And again, the first 10 respondents through SurveyMonkey got a $15 Price Right gift card. So here's what actually happened. in the flood zone, we targeted surveying people who were living in the flood zone. Only 18 people responded, but we added an additional 25 Latinx people to be surveyed because we wanted the survey to be representative of community demographics. And in the end, 47 people responded online and 90 people responded in total. Here's some basic results of our surveys. 97% of people surveyed were renters. 74% lived in Olneyville less than 5 years. The primary age was pretty young for the people who we surveyed. Most of them were under 50. And over 50% were Hispanic or Latinx. Here's some of the things that we found out about people. About 50% knew little or nothing about climate change. When we asked them if the climate was changing in Olneyville, though, 63% said yes. And when we asked them what that meant to them, they identified themes of flooding, more extreme weather, and maybe more illness, flu or fever. Then we asked how likely we thought it was that there would be a disaster in Olneyville. And by that point, 71% thought it would be very likely or somewhat likely. And 75% thought the impact would be pretty severe to them. Here's some major results. 83% of the people that we surveyed did not actually experience flooding themselves, but they were able to guess at what might be the biggest problems that would happen to them in the next flood. And they were loss of power, safety, food and water access, property damage, and just being able to get out. We also wanted to ask people about the heat effects of climate change because Olneyville is a very paved area. And as you saw from one of our earlier maps, there is a big heat island component to that section of Providence. So we asked people how they stayed cool in the summer. And 45 of them said they had air conditioning, and 7 of them said that they like to go outside to parks or beaches. I'm not going to go over all of these results for our questions on how well are you prepared for a hazard, but the big takeaway is most people were not prepared at all for a hazard. And only 6 out of all of our surveyed people had flood insurance. And 33% said that they were not planning to do anything about preparing. So some big responses, stratified by ethnicity. This is really Hispanic, Latinx versus non-Latinx. People who were worried about having to move out of their home were a much higher percentage of the Latinx population, and a much higher percentage of people who are not planning on doing anything were Latinx also. Overall, surveying was not easy. First of all, there were lots of abandoned homes in the target zones. So we had to look outside of our target zones to complete enough surveys to make it useful. 90% of those surveyed in Olneyville did not experience flooding. They were too new to the area. And 70% of those surveyed who were not planning on doing anything are Latinx. And we made some conjectures based on what FEMA had said about why people didn't prepare. And we thought that it was mostly because they don't have the experience. It's not something that they saw themselves. And they were worried that it was too expensive to prepare. So I really loved the idea of the, climate preparedness scavenger hunt, just with the dollar store ideas. And that's one of the things that we're hoping to show people. So when we get to step 2 for us, after that collection of data, we had to decide, well, how are we going to go about trying to educate people and help them be prepared for an emergency situation? And one, we want to increase their connection to the disasters, to increase their motivation to prepare. We want to demonstrate that disaster preparedness can be affordable, and we want them to know what the responsibility of their landlords are and what their responsibilities are around being prepared, because most of the people that we surveyed were renters. So we're going to create a short film called Stories from the Flood that will hopefully address all of those issues. And we're going to show it in local places like laundromats, workplaces, schools, churches, public housing complexes, and at tenant meetings. But we're also going to use some resources that we have already established in Olneyville to demonstrate things that can be done to mitigate the effects of flooding. For example, we already have a green infrastructure showcase tour at one of the local parks in Olneyville, Riverside Park. And there are about 5 different types of green infrastructure demonstrated at that park, along with the sign that you see here. Nature is at work here, and it shows how green infrastructure can clean the water, help prevent flooding. When that economy symbol there on the left is using a local workforce to create these things, so it puts people to work. It can help things be cooler, to create more wellness in the neighborhood, and also to create vital habitat that we are missing in such a populated and paved area. These signs are all in English and in Spanish. We have one of each at each location. This other example is the Red Shed Bike Shop. It is where we have bike camp for 100 kids in Riverside Park during the summer, but it has this wonderful green roof that is thriving right now, and it's kind of a great place to show off how it cools things off, because the Red Shed used to be a very hot place, but now that it has a nice green roof, the campers and the counselors are a lot cooler, and it looks really neat.
Alicia, can I ask you to wrap it up real quickly here?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yep, so this is just another example of a project in Olneyville Square. There's nothing here. You can see what the pavement looks like. We're going to put in a green infrastructure project there that's going to green up the square and take all the water from there. And our goal in the end is really to build leadership among the adults in Olneyville and build confidence. And we're just about to kick off a new project called New Voices at the Water Table, where we're planning to develop a cohort of interested adults that will feel empowered and knowledgeable enough to take part in the city discussions about climate change and what is important in their community. And that's all I have. Allegra and I are both here if there's any questions.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm not seeing any questions. Please, if you have questions, type them into the box. Thank you for that presentation. I also want to remind folks, please download the surveys if you think that they might be helpful for your own work. Alicia was kind enough to provide them as a Word document so people can modify them as needed. I want to take time to thank our presenters. Thank you all, Jennifer, Alicia, and Juliana. Their email addresses are here, so if you have any questions following up, you can certainly contact them directly. I also wanted to encourage everybody to take a look at these links that we included in the PDF. Actually, they're not in the PDF. We'll follow up with an email in the next day and include these. If you're not familiar with these resources around climate change education and messaging and communication and best practices, etc., all 4 of these resources are incredibly useful. And then finally, in that webinar that you'll receive, there's an evaluation form. Please take a minute to provide us with some feedback, but also want to highlight, we're heading into River Rally next week, our national conference, but once we come out of that tunnel, we will be posting more training opportunities on this topic of community and climate resilience, and also future webinars on the other series we're in the middle of on gentrification and displacement. So we'll get the word out about that. On the 18th, we do have another webinar coming up on our drinking water theme, understanding how the money is supposed to flow, looking at water infrastructure funding. So there's a lot more. If you see the link at the bottom, Urban Waters Learning Network, Renee's been doing a great job posting resources. We'll see about posting some of the resources that maybe were referenced today with presenter permission. There's more stuff there from the Yale Communications Lab and other places. So take a look at the resources page in Urban Waters. Are there any other questions that have come up, Renee? Do you see any?
There was one question that somebody would like to have more information about the Build Leadership New Voices at the Water Table. And so we'll try to connect Martha with Alicia.
Great. All right. So that is it. I want to thank you again and thank all of our speakers for taking the time, and all of you for taking the time to join. If you're new to the Urban Waters Learning Network and want to hear more about that, please be in touch with me or with Maria Brodeen, who is also one of the coordinators from Groundwork USA. But we are out of time. Thank you for sticking with us to the very end of today's session. We will provide a link to the recording in that email that you'll receive, and we'll be uploading this to the Urban Waters Learning Network page and the River Networks resources page. We'll shortly have the recording to today's session. So with that, thank you, everybody. I'm seeing your comments of appreciation. Thanks to our speakers. And if we don't see you at River Rally in Cleveland next week, we hope to see you at the next webinar coming up here in the end of July. Take a look at our website. We'll post that date here soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.